It's 2015, and the Denver Broncos are on top of the world. John Elway is on top of the world. John Elway built a roster so strong that it was able to carry two quarterbacks who were playing below average to a decisive Super Bowl victory. This team was built perfectly and stacked with all-pro talent all over the board. Defensively, you had a terrifying defensive line anchored by all-pros DeMarcus Ware and Von Miller. Couple this with really good interior players like Sylvester Williams, Derek Wolfe, and Malik Jackson, and you have a front five that very few teams have the ability to block. And it wasn't like that was the only strong spot of this defense, because the back end of the defense had its own all-pro duo in Aqib Talib and Chris Harris. Then on the offensive side of the ball, whether it was Peyton Manning or Brock Osweiler, they would be joined by Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas, a complement of wide receivers any quarterback would be lucky to have in 2015. This year, the Broncos had utilized two quarterbacks. The young second-round draft pick, Brock Osweiler, who looks solid in certain starts, but was definitely carried by the defense. And then, of course, there was the Hall of Famer, Peyton Manning, who had started his run with Denver very, very well. At the top of his prime, it seemed. But at this point, Peyton Manning had clearly entered the twilight of his career, and it was obvious that this Super Bowl win would be his final win in game in the NFL. But there was optimism at the position behind Manning. There was talk about Brock Osweiler maybe starting over Peyton Manning. And the thought was out there that Brock Osweiler was going to get paid when he hit free agency after the Super Bowl. And with a good enough quarterback like Osweiler seemed like he would be, and a dominant defense, this seemed like a team that would have a very wide Super Bowl window. But what we found out is that just as fast as the Super Bowl window opens, it closes even faster. And in the 2016 offseason is where this collapse started to begin. This year, the team was not able to sign Malik Jackson and Brock Osweiler, as they both signed for big money elsewhere, which, honestly, those turned out to be good decisions. Malik Jackson hasn't exactly torn up in Jacksonville, and Brock Osweiler was so bad in Houston that Houston gave up a second-round pick to the Browns, which turned out to be Nick Chubb, and the Browns then in turn cut Osweiler so he can end up back on the Denver Broncos. So those two signings aren't the blows and weren't where Denver hurt themselves. Where Denver hurt themselves this offseason is where they hurt themselves in every offseason after they've won the Super Bowl. And that is with quarterback decisions. Now, since the team did not re-sign Brock Osweiler, they were in a position where they had to replace Brock Osweiler. And this is where the mess started. In a scramble to replace Brock Osweiler, they traded for Mark Sanchez and decided to have a quarterback competition between 7th-round pick Trevor Siemian, Mark Sanchez, and 1st-round rookie Paxton Lynch. In the immediate future, this didn't look terrible, as Trevor Siemian did look like he had some potential for a few games, and that team that year did have a winning record. But under the surface, if you look a little harder, it was probably the decision that killed the Super Bowl window for the Denver Broncos. Because going with a quarterback competition essentially between Trevor Siemian and Mark Sanchez was a safe decision. There was not a lot of risk there. They took a risk by drafting Paxton Lynch in the 1st round. And while Trevor Siemian at least turned out to be a solid backup, Paxton Lynch never proved to be an NFL-worthy player. What makes this worse for Broncos fans is that since they had reached for Paxton Lynch in the 1st round and got him, they decided to not draft Dak Prescott, who probably would have fit Kubiak's offense, would have won a lot of games with the offensive support he would have had, and with the dominant defense behind him. The Denver Broncos made the biggest mistake a NFL front office can do when it comes to the quarterback position, and that is to not prioritize the quarterback decision. Now, I'm going to tell you about a little thing called quarterback hell. Because yes, there is such a thing as quarterback hell. Now, how do you get into quarterback hell? Well, that's easy. Just lose your franchise quarterback and have no plan. See, getting into quarterback hell is easy. Everybody's allowed. Getting out of quarterback hell, well, that's the hard part. And the number one mentality that will keep you in quarterback hell is the you don't need a great quarterback to win a Super Bowl mentality. Now, while on one hand, I can understand how a team that won a Super Bowl the way the Broncos did in 2015 would fall into this trap and then into this mindset, I also have to acknowledge how mind-boggling it is that the guy who fell into this mindset is John Elway. John freaking Elway. John, first pick overall, Elway. Nobody knew their value and worth as a quarterback more than John Elway did as a player. And John Elway even knew that when he got rid of Tim Tebow to sign Peyton Manning. But the 2015 Super Bowl changed how he thought about the position, and from here on, the Broncos will be plagued by not taking enough risk at the quarterback position from here out. In the 2017 offseason, there honestly wasn't a good move for the Broncos to make at quarterback, so they had to continue to rely on Trevor Siemian in hope that Paxton Lynch would develop. He did not. The team also lost DeMarcus Ware and Sylvester Williams. Add this on top of Malik Jackson lost last year, and that is a strong hit to a very strong defensive line. And more importantly, Gary Kubiak retired. So now the Broncos had two problems. They clearly didn't have a quarterback of the future, and they had to hire a new head coach. Now, modern NFL logic would say that you would sign a offensive head coach so you can draft a young quarterback or develop a young guy or take a risk on a younger guy and really work with that and fix your quarterback problems that way. The Denver Broncos chose a different route when they signed Vance Joseph. And also in 2018 was when the Denver Broncos doubled down on their safe quarterback mentality and firmly placed the Denver Broncos in quarterback hell. Now, this offseason was extremely important because the core of that dominant defense of years past was starting to fall apart as guys got older and guys had left the Broncos. Last year, they hired a defensive coach in Vance Joseph, and if there was any year to take a risk on a quarterback, it would be this year. But did the Broncos do that? No. They signed Case Keenum. Now, granted, Case was coming off a career year in Minnesota, but also everybody knew what the deal was with that. Nobody had saw Case Keenum's season in Minnesota as anything more than an aberration. And everybody had the same prevailing thought. The Broncos made a very safe decision at quarterback. They could have spent money on somebody like Kirk Cousins. They could have taken a flyer on a guy like Teddy Bridgewater, or they could have selected with their 5th overall pick a talent like Josh Allen, or the even more enticing option of Lamar Jackson. But instead, they went with the safe and economic choice, Case Keenum, who played like Case Keenum. Then in the 2019 offseason, the Broncos had fired Vance Joseph and were looking for a head coach. Now, they were in the same situation that they were in a few years ago, and they could have chose to go in a different direction and take more risk. Did they do that? No, they hired Vic Fangio, who was also a defensive coordinator, longtime coach. Again, safe decision. And they got rid of Case Keenum, but then they brought in bigger Case Keenum, Joe Flacco. And then they drafted Drew Lock, who hasn't played much, but when we've seen him on the field, he has resembled Paxton Lynch. Not saying Drew Lock is a bust because he's barely played, but also the Broncos quarterback situation is not much different than it was the year after they lost Peyton Manning. And now the Broncos are stuck with a Joe Flacco who's hurt and whose play was honestly far behind his 2012 glory days, while they passed on options like Teddy Bridgewater, who won 5 games for the Saints, and Gardner Minshew, who has made the Jacksonville Jaguars a good team. And now the Denver Broncos aren't in a great situation because 4 years after that Super Bowl team, that dominant core that they once had has largely either left or severely declined. Malik Jackson is no longer on the team. Sylvester Williams also left. DeMarcus Ware retired in 2017. Aqib Talib was traded in 2018. So was Demaryius Thomas. Emmanuel Sanders was traded this year. And it looks like Chris Harris could be traded in any minute. And their crown jewel piece in Von Miller is getting older and older as the team gets worse and worse. So what did we learn here? Championship windows are very, very fragile in the NFL. And the Denver Broncos did not realize that and wasted it making safe quarterback decisions and questionable head coach hirings. The Broncos could have extended their window by drafting Dak Prescott or even taking a flyer on Teddy Bridgewater. They could have created a new window by taking a chance on Lamar Jackson, but they played it safe, and now they sit firmly in quarterback hell. And that is how the Denver Broncos collapsed.